welcome, and thank you for being here. It is my pleasure to be back in Denmark. It's one of my favorite places in the whole world. And this is a topic very, very dear to my heart. I know that there are wonderful teachers, wonderful educators, wonderful psychologists here in Denmark. But in Scandinavia in general, there's been a lot of overlooking of the gifted population. So I'm hoping that this presentation, which Paul was kind enough to invite me to do a presentation and an article about, that this information will be shared with all of the people that you represent. I know each of you has a whole group of people that are with you in spirit and that you'll go back and share this information with. And I hope it makes a difference. I hope it helps. This is a favorite quotation of mine. It's from a book called Excellence. Can We Be Equal and Excellent Too? By John W. Gardner. And it's a very old book. It came out in the 60s. If we think about all children having an equal right to try to be successful, to strive to be successful, and our job as educators is to help all children become successful, then from a success model, it doesn't make sense at all to embrace giftedness. We have to look at giftedness as not the potential for success, but look at it differently, and that's what I'm going to share, a different way of looking at it, one that comes out of special education. The mission of education is to foster development of all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender identification, economic status, geographic location, linguistic background, or sexual preference. No one would intentionally stunt the growth of a child. No one wants to do that. Yet that is what educational systems do when they are blind to individual differences in ability. And there's another quote from John Gardner. Human societies have severely and successfully limited the realization of individual promise. So when we're talking about equity, we have to separate the notions of equity and equality. I don't know whether you can read this, but it says equality is giving everyone a shoe. Equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. So think of that in terms of an education that fits. Everyone deserves equal opportunity. Equal opportunity can never mean equal outcomes. We cannot set the exact same educational goals for the entire student body. That would be brutally inappropriate for all students who learn faster or slower than the norm. While the goal for one child is to be able to read books, the goal for another is to be able to write them. One student needs to master sufficient basic mathematics to balance a budget in adult life, while another needs exposure to enough advanced mathematics to be able to discover a new source of energy. As educators, we are not in the business of creating identical automatons. Sameness is boring. Diversity is necessary, including intellectual diversity, for the vast range of responsibilities in the world. Some tasks require a staggering degree of intelligence. I worked with a young woman early in my career in the United States who wanted to go to college early. And she applied at all of these colleges, and she eventually got a scholarship to California Technological Institute. Caltech is one of our most prestigious math science universities. And she was going away to college at the age of 14. I know we don't do that here, but she was ready, definitely ready. And I got to spend a weekend with her before she left for college. And she didn't go alone. Her parents went with her, and the whole family moved to the area so that they would be there to support her. So I asked her, do you have a sense of mission, a sense of purpose? Is there something special that you came here to do? And she said, yes. I said, well, how old were you when you discovered what your mission was? She said, I was 9. I said, would you be willing to share with me what you feel your mission in life is? And she said, my mission is to translate ancient Sanskrit documents in such a way that in modern life, people can understand that religion and science are actually one. And I thought, you need 190 IQ to do that. And that's what she had, was 190 IQ. But we're living in an era where that's an unpopular concept. We're being told all the time in media, in books, in colleges, that everyone has the same amount of intelligence, that we're all born with equal intelligence. And popular writers tell us that everyone is of equal ability. The only difference between the successful ones and the unsuccessful ones is the work ethic, how hard you're willing to work. So if you put in extra effort, or you have grit, or you have a certain number of hours of practice, and you have a success mindset, that's all it takes to be successful. And in a competitive culture like the United States, which is highly competitive and where most of these ideas originate, it is comforting to believe that no one is smarter than everyone else, just some people work harder. The question I have is this true? Or is this just a belief system that we use in the United States to comfort ourselves? And if you study psychology, you know that we have had over 100 years of research on intelligence and on the vast diversity of intelligence that is not represented by this popular viewpoint. Any of you work with children at the other end of the spectrum, children who are in special education, children who have intellectual disability? Anyone here have a special education background? So you'll be very familiar with what I'm going to share now. We look in terms of standard deviations of difference, and each standard deviation is not just a statistical artifact. Every standard deviation is a different level of understanding and a different level of functioning. So these may not be terms you use in Denmark, I didn't check. But in the United States, a child who is one standard deviation below the norm is thought of as a slow learner in the regular classroom. Is that typical here as well? And that is where they are. They're in the regular classroom, and they do have suggestions to help them keep up, and sometimes they will go to a resource room to get some assistance in mathematics or in reading. It may take them longer to learn to read or longer to do mathematics. At the second standard deviation below the norm, that is special education. And that's true in Denmark, and it's true in Sweden, and it's true, as far as I know, in every Scandinavian country. In most of the countries that I was able to research in the world use that 2 standard deviation as the cutoff for special ed, because at 2 standard deviations, the differences truly are significant. That's the mildly disabled range. But there are differences in severity. So at 3 standard deviations below the norm, the child is moderately disabled. At 4 standard deviations, severely disabled. And at 5 standard deviations, profoundly disabled. And those have meaning and import, which we'll talk about in a minute. When children's performance is around 2 standard deviations from the norm, they qualify as special needs students in most countries. Their development is significantly different from the rest of the school population. Comprising approximately 2% of the population, they require adaptations of the curriculum and teachers who understand their development. So these are what those functional differences look like. At 1 standard deviation below the norm, the child needs support in the regular classroom, but that is where they're placed. At 2 standard deviations below the norm, they're coded in most countries into special education, which may mean special classes, or it may mean an aid in the classroom to help them. But there's very clear motor, speech, social, and cognitive delays. And that goes with being 2 standard deviations below. When you're 3 standard deviations below the norm, these are children who require assistance with daily living. So we're talking about very different functional levels. At 4 standard deviations, children are unable to help themselves. They are not independent. They function with assistance. And at 5 standard deviations, they're unable to deal with their own needs. They basically need custodial care. So the children who are 1 standard deviation below the norm will be in the workforce. They will not probably go to college, but they will be in the workforce, and they will have perhaps lower paying jobs. I don't know, but the children at 2 standard deviations below may or may not be in the workforce independently. They may need some supervision. The children at 3 standard deviations with quite a bit of supervision, they may be able to do some work, but children at the 4th and the 5th standard deviations below the norm are not in the workforce. Special programs are essential for welfare of children with special needs. This is a truism everywhere. What is not understood is that the need for individualization increases with degree of difference from the norm in either direction. Those who study advanced students find that the same principle applies to the gifted. So we are at this conference, and in the United States and in most countries, we're most interested in academically talented children. We see them as having a great deal of potential, a great deal of ability to be successful and to become leaders. But we also have to understand that that's just the bare minimum, just like the slow learner in the regular classroom isn't even considered mildly disabled. We get to the gifted range at about 130, and that's the moderately gifted range, and that's 2 standard deviations above the norm. And at 3 standard deviations above the norm, psychometrically, we're in the highly gifted range. And 4 standard deviations were at the exceptionally gifted range. And 5 standard deviations were at the profoundly gifted range. There is that much discrepancy in the gifted population as there is in the intellectually disabled population. With each of these functional levels needing something different. But where are all of these children? Where is the differentiation? Where is the appreciation of those differences built into the educational system? It's not. We get pockets, and we're starting to see programs develop. And it's gratifying that so many of you came today. But you're on the forefront of these children being understood where you come from. In our zeal to believe that we're all created with equal intelligence, we discriminate against the gifted. We don't like to think of ourselves as discriminating against anyone, but that is what we do. If we refuse to acknowledge the existence of giftedness, and we refuse to provide appropriate educational provisions for children with significant differences, their learning and emotional needs will go unattended. Placing all students in the same program with the same learning goals, regardless of level of ability, just doesn't make any sense. Many gifted children endure school. How many of you know children who talk to you all the time about they're not learning anything? Is it fair? Is it fair for a segment of our population to go to school and not learn anything? Really? And then we have the audacity to call these children lazy and unmotivated when we don't give them anything challenging to wrap their minds around. And we say, you need to learn to work hard. Well, how many of you have been admonished yourself for not working hard enough? You needed to work harder. Well, let's see, what does it take for a student to want to put in work? A strong work ethic cannot be acquired if the student already knows the material. To instill motivation, it's necessary to allow each student the right to struggle. It's only through struggling that real learning occurs. If the curriculum is the same for everyone, and gifted students learn it in much less time, we deprive them of the right to struggle, which is, in education, we're not teaching them how to learn, and they have to struggle in order to learn how to learn. How are egalitarian values served by teaching students what they already know? How would they learn to work hard if the curriculum is so easy that school is effortless? Effort is kindled when students wrestle with new concepts at a level of complexity that stretches them. And the major figure who taught us about that was Lev Vygotsky. How many of you learned about Vygotsky? The zone of proximal development. So Vygotsky said that when you find just the right, exact, perfect, teachable moment, the child will become lit with the fire of wanting to learn. And if it's too hard, they're not going to try. They're going to say they can't. But if it's too easy, they also are not going to try. It has to be just that sweet spot. An appropriate level of challenge is essential for learning to be meaningful. The art of teaching is finding the right degree of challenge for each student, the sweet spot where the task is not too hard and not too easy. The ideal teachable moment inspires full engagement of the child. The aha of problem solving releases endorphins that create exhilaration. Learning then becomes its own reward. How often do gifted children in our classrooms experience the thrill of learning in their own ZPD, their own zone of proximal development? Is it possible that lack of effort is related to inappropriate or lack of challenge rather than being a character flaw in some of our brightest students? Now, this is a new concept that I came across just before I wrote the article that you're going to be getting today. It's on intersectionality, and it has to do with minority groups having multiple identities. So if a person is Black, Jewish, gay, poor, immigrant, whatever, they have multiple social identities that interact with each other to create a whole that's different from its parts. In the US, we get quite an outcry, and there's one going on right now, coast to coast, that there are not enough ethnic minority children represented in gifted programs. So the solution to that from the superintendents and the boards of education is, well, then we should eliminate the program. If it's not fair to everyone, let's just eliminate it. But that doesn't work, because if you eliminate gifted programs, the children who need it the most, who don't have any other way of being recognized or getting their talents developed, will have nothing. Gifted children of color may feel very isolated. The gifted program may be the only place where they feel safe, where they make friends who understand them, and where they are urged to develop their talents. And there's also been a question in the US about whether giftedness is a function of wealth. And the reason that that comes up all the time is that in affluent neighborhoods, there are more gifted children. The percentage of gifted children who need services is higher. But that is not the reality of how giftedness is distributed. If you were to take all of the gifted people in the world and line them up, the vast majority of gifted people internationally are poor. The poor far outnumber the rich. And it is gifted education that has allowed children of poor families to be able to distinguish themselves, to further themselves, to have a life different from the lives of their parents. So there are a much greater number of gifted children among the lower classes, and that's something in the US many people don't realize. I believe that we need to identify children of poverty very early, and if we give support to them, that it's going to be life-changing for them. But this is a question I have, and I may be mistaken in my viewpoint here. I would love to have some correction if I'm wrong. But I'm guessing that in Scandinavia, the group that you miss the most are the twice exceptional. And I think you miss them because I know that IQ testing is not popular. And IQ testing is not just to rank order people's intelligence, it's also to find disabilities. We're finding that an enormous number of the people who come to us for testing are twice exceptional. In the beginning, when I started the Gifted Development Center 40 years ago, our purpose was to find children for schools that we had in Denver, for the gifted, and for special programs that were available through the universities, like this one. Most of the universities provide some kind of summer program or Saturday program or something for gifted students. And what they've learned, which is very interesting, how many of you are with universities? I was with the University of Denver, and we had programs for high school students who were gifted who could take college courses. We had a talent search program that we worked with junior high school, or like 7th and 8th and 9th graders, and that is still happening at the University of Denver campus. But I learned a long time ago that when you bring gifted children onto a college campus and they like it, they often matriculate there later. So having a gifted program at a university is a very good way of finding students, good students that you want to have there. Anyway, so IQ tests reveal disabilities. And we, at the very beginning, when we were just trying to get students into these university programs or into schools for the gifted, we found that 1/6 of the children who came for testing had hidden learning disabilities. They were hidden because when you're very smart, your gifts mask your disabilities. They cover them up, and so no one knows they're there. You could be dyslexic without anyone ever knowing until you're in college. There was a story of a 6-year-old. They found out this boy was profoundly hearing impaired, but he was so good at facing the teacher and reading the teacher's lips and taking his mother's face in his hands when he was a toddler and reading her lips that no one knew until he was 6 years old that he had a profound hearing loss. So intelligence can cover up a multitude of problems. And what happens when you use a strict cutoff score is that learning disabilities will pull down IQ scores. But properly used, IQ tests will find gifted children with learning disabilities, and that's the majority of the children we work with today. We have tested now over 6,500 children. Are any of you doctoral students? Are you working on your doctorate? Any of you researchers? I want you to know that our database is available for researchers to come and use. We have 1,100 some odd cases already entered into SPSS and about 400 variables on each child. So there's a lot of different things that can be studied by looking at a gifted population. So when you're both gifted and you have a learning disability, it's very complicated. You don't know whether you're smart or you don't feel smart at all. It depends on what you're asked to do. The gifted can use their sharp minds to compensate. The greater your capacity for abstract reasoning, the more you can use reasoning instead of a modality strength to compensate for your weaknesses. However, anyone who has to compensate gets tired. There's a cost to compensation. If your hearing isn't good and so you're really concentrating as well as you can with your vision, or your vision isn't very good and you're really working very, very hard to listen, whatever it is that you're using to compensate wears you out. It takes extra energy to compensate. And compensation, the cost of it is fatigue. So twice exceptional children often come home from school very tired and not willing to do their homework right after school. They're too tired to do any more work. Compensation is individual. Every child develops it his or her own way, and sometimes it's unconscious. One thing I'm learning about in great deal lately is that a lot of our children, when they're toddlers, have double vision. And the way that they deal with double vision is to block out the second image. When they do that habitually and block out that second image, it makes them have tunnel vision and they lose some of their peripheral vision. So this compensation, it's very different for each person. And what they develop might work when they're in their first years, their primary years, but then as the print gets smaller or the work gets harder, the compensations may not work. Or they go from one level to another level and it stops working. And if a child is very well compensated, it's much harder to detect the problem. It isn't that compensation cures. It doesn't make it go away. It just makes you able to cope for short periods of time until your energy gives out. So let's talk a little bit about this concept of giftedness as the potential for success. I have some real issues with it, as you can tell. We look for children who pay attention, who do their work, they're on time, they listen, they're respectful, they ask questions, they study, they stay on task, they stay out of trouble, they're prepared. Your ideal student may or may not be your gifted student. That student may be a high achiever, but may not be a gifted student. When giftedness is defined as the potential to succeed, high marks in school or other indicators of achievement then egalitarian values are compromised because success is a goal for all students. We can't say we're going to pick out the potentially successful ones and give them an extra opportunity to be successful, because people will say that's not fair. For egalitarianism and the pursuit of excellence to form a harmonious union, we need to define giftedness differently. When giftedness is understood as special needs from a special education lens, the mirror of intellectual disability, then these children who are very diverse, very different, significantly different from others, are protected by the values of egalitarianism. Gifted children are part of the biodiversity of the population. We need to grow beyond the narrow confines of competitiveness to appreciate the gifted instead of being threatened by them. When we look at the gifted from a global perspective, it's clear that the development of each person's gifts benefits all of society. Every human being has a unique contribution to make to the whole. But here's an egalitarian society that has made a motto out of cutting down the tall poppies. Australia, New Zealand, down under, the gifted are called tall poppies. How many of you have visited and down under and you have come across this phenomenon? So cutting down the tall poppy is, when I first encountered this on my first trip to Australia, I thought that it was people just liked having poppy fields that all had the same height. I didn't know that it had a deeper meaning. It wasn't, and we adopted at the Gifted Development Center the poppy, the tall poppy, as the symbol for our center. So if anyone wants a card, the card has our poppy symbol on it. But after we moved into this new location, and we have poppies everywhere around our office, then we started to really investigate what did it mean? The tall poppy syndrome has a very grisly history. It's attacking anyone of exceptional ability who might have leadership potential and might be able to get people who are under domination to rebel against it. So from the very beginning of war and conquering, the advice has been, when you conquer a nation, you destroy the tall poppies. You lop off the heads of the clergy, of the leaders, of the eminent, of the gifted, of anyone who has respect by the populace. Because if you get rid of those leaders, those people that you've just conquered are more likely to follow you. So when I say, I don't really care if gifted people become doctors or lawyers or have patents or compose symphonies or become famous, I just want them to have the right to survive. It's because in history, we really have destroyed many, many gifted people, specifically for their giftedness. John Gardner talks about it in this quote, "But extreme equalitarianism, or as I would prefer to say, equalitarianism wrongly conceived, which ignores differences in native capacity and achievement, has not served democracy well. Carried far enough, it means lopping off any heads which come above dead level. It means committee rule, the individual smothered by the group. And it means the end of that striving for excellence which has produced mankind's greatest achievements." So here we have a group of special needs. As a special educator, I believe the gifted have special needs. But they're the only special needs group that can pretend to be like everybody else. Most gifted people expend an inordinate amount of energy trying to hide their differences, all the while knowing that they're not like everyone else. Instead of feeling better than everyone else because they're smart, more often they feel that their differences make them defective. When you ask a gifted child, "What do you want?" they don't say, "I want to make a fortune. I want to be known after I die. I want to go to the best colleges." You know what they say? "I want a friend. I want a friend. I want to fit in." Fitting in is so important to this group that they're forced to hide their abilities rather than to develop them. And it should not be like this. No one should be ashamed of being different. The gifted deserve the same protection in schools as all other diverse groups. Their diversity needs to be recognized. Schools should be emotionally safe for them to stand tall and be proud of who they are. And in case you might think that these are just American issues, but they don't have anything to do with Denmark, these are some questions that are from Danish young people from the past couple weeks. They want to know, how do I handle my huge emotions? Why do I feel so bad about myself if I'm so smart? Why do I act and perceive the world so differently from others? And how do I make friends when I'm so different from others? So I had a revelation that I want to share with you. The last time I was here, a year ago, on the way back on the plane, I asked the stewardess for a sheet of paper and a pencil, because I had a vision of all these different viewpoints of what giftedness is all about and how we could chart them into one chart. And why it is that there's differences of opinion about whether gifted children have overexcitabilities or they have higher sensitivity. And why do many of the academics in the United States say that no, there's no differences? And our population, we're seeing differences all the time. Why is there a disconnect? So the stewardess gave me a little napkin with a beer advertisement on it and a pen, which didn't do much. I wasn't able to do anything with that. But I got home, I still couldn't sleep. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I took 6 sheets of A4 paper, European paper, it's longer, and taped them together. And then I was able to draw what I had seen, which was a cutoff of the end of the curve, and then this curve going way out here. And I was able to group the different perceptions of what giftedness was all about. And I remembered that Michael Piahowski had said to me, remember that in the extremes, quantitative differences become qualitative. So I mentioned this to Frank Falk, who is our director of research, and he said, it's a very easy way for you to see how this works. Think of water. When it gets very, very cold, it becomes ice. That's qualitatively different from water. When it becomes very, very hot, it becomes steam, and that's qualitatively different from water. And that metaphor has helped me to put some things in perspective. And I asked the question, at what point does water turn into steam? Where do these differences actually occur? These are some of the differences we've seen in the children who come to us for testing. Sensitivity, intensity, empathy, overexcitability, moral awareness, concern for justice. How many of you have seen these traits in gifted children? Now, I've been publicly called on the carpet for having the audacity to put moral awareness in that list, because are you saying that gifted people are more morally aware than other people? Yes, I am. I'm definitely saying that. So we've done some research, and based on this question of at what point does water turn into steam? And in December, we took the data from about 1,120 children, many of whom were exceptionally gifted. Our database is very skewed. We have the highest number of children above 160 IQ that has ever been studied. And all their data is already in our data analysis program. And what we found were, when we looked at our characteristics of giftedness, we have 26 characteristics of giftedness. We found 2 cutoff points. The first cutoff point was at 130 IQ. The children who were 2 standard deviations above the norm, their parents endorsed many more characteristics of giftedness than those who were below 130 IQ. The second cutoff point was at 145 IQ. The children at 3 standard deviations above the norm, or 4 or 5 or more, there was a significant difference between the number and intensity of the characteristics that the parents endorsed for that group. But what fascinated me the most was the lack of differentiation between 125 and 90. Parents of children with 90 IQ and parents of children with 100 IQ and parents of children with 110 IQ, and parents of children with 120 IQ and 125 IQ did not have a different number of characteristics of giftedness that they endorsed. So that, I thought, was quite revealing about the answer to my question. When we're dealing with academically talented children, which is the basis of most of the studies that you will read in the literature, any literature coming from the United States and most literature coming from other countries, they're not actually studying the gifted. They're studying the academically talented. And when they study the academically talented, and then they use a control group of children who are not selected for gifted programs, they don't find significant differences. That's because they're not there. When you study children who are 2 or 3 standard deviations above the norm, you do see a real difference. Cold water is not ice. Nobody in any country takes the bottom 10% of the school and puts them into special ed. It's not done. It's not done because children in the bottom 10% are not significantly different. The brightest 10% of the population is very warm water, but you're not going to understand the properties of steam by studying hot water. And that's what I think most of the literature we have with gifted and control groups, and why we're not seeing the differences that I think we should be seeing, is that when we do a cutoff, the broader our definition of giftedness, and in the United States it's very popular for children to get into gifted programs with 120 IQ, the vast majority of children will be 120, 121, 122, 123. They will gravitate, most of the dots will gravitate to the cutoff score. If you're a person in this group with a 130, or a person in this group with a 145, and they aggregate the data, your differences are not going to show up. They're going to be buried in all those other dots. And I think that's why there's such backlash in my field in the United States against the inner differences of the gifted, because the population they're studying doesn't show it. Now, I am going to go very seriously into this question of moral leadership because I think it's an important one. Plato in the Republic advised testing the mettle of youth and preparing the gold ones to become philosopher kings, leaders who could rule with wisdom. Wisdom is not something every single person even wants, let alone can attain. While everyone deserves an equal opportunity to be successful, every child in the classroom does not have an equal capacity to be wise. Wisdom depends on perspective taking. The ability to take the perspective of others does correlate with giftedness. If we want wise leaders rather than popular and successful leaders, we need to nurture the segment of the population we now neglect. This is what Lita Hollingworth, who started the field of gifted education, believed that leaders needed. There were others, but these were top in her priorities. Leaders needed intelligence. Leaders needed integrity, creative imagination, stability. And this is one of my favorite quotes. No one ever advocated stupidity as a qualification for a leader. But if we want moral leaders, then we have to choose people who have the intellectual capacity to grasp the perspective of others. And high intelligence, in fact, there's been study after study for 100 years in all countries about that connection. I'm just going to read these to you quickly because we don't have much time. Gifted children had greater empathy and used higher levels of care-oriented moral reasoning than children of average ability in a study that was done in Australia. Gifted children showed higher levels of empathy than average children, and empathy levels increased with age. That was D. Levecki in the United States. Gifted children scored higher than non-gifted children in emotional empathy in a study in Israel. In studies in Canada and the US, 20 years apart, with different instruments, gifted preschoolers demonstrated advanced perspective taking. Gifted third graders showed advanced sensitivity to feelings and perspective of others when compared to non-gifted classmates. Moral reasoning. Lita Hollingworth wrote that children over 180 IQ were troubled at a much younger age than average children over issues of right and wrong and problems of evil. Miraca Gross, when she wrote the book Exceptionally Gifted Children in Australia, said children over 160 IQ were more advanced than age peers in conceptualization of moral precepts such as fairness, justice, and sense of responsibility for self and others. Gifted children had more advanced levels of reasoning and moral dilemmas. The work that we did one compilation of 919 children and found out that 810 of them had been described by their parents as morally sensitive and concerned with justice and fairness. I believe that the goals for education of the gifted should be ethical judgment, wisdom, compassion, and moral leadership, not success. And if you can't read that on the side, it says, in order to be compassionate, you have to think about being compassionate. In order to be ethical, you have to think about being ethical. The key is to learn how to think well. When success is not wedded to ethics, society becomes diseased, a breeding ground for oppression and bigotry. And we certainly are seeing that in our country. Throughout history, it has been the gifted who stood up against unethical regimes and fought for those who could not defend themselves. Intelligence brings responsibility. Responsibility for the welfare of others and the welfare of the planet. Intelligence questions. Intelligence demands fairness. Intelligence is a threat to self-serving governments. High intelligence is risky. It needs your support. And there are countries where the highly intelligent have been eliminated. So I'm going to recommend 5 basic educational principles in working with gifted children. Individualize instruction to whatever extent possible. Allow gifted students to progress at their own rate. Take the glass ceiling off what students are allowed to learn. Seriously consider acceleration. Ask gifted students what they need, and then listen to them. Gifted children are expected to wait patiently while other children learn skills and knowledge they've already mastered. They're taught to slow down their natural rate of learning to make the other students and their teachers more comfortable. They learn to be less than they can be, to slide by without stretching themselves, to deny their talents, and eventually to trade their dreams for simpler, less demanding goals. This tragic waste of potential affects not only the students, but all of society, for we have all lost whatever gifts they might have contributed. There are countless cases of vanishing giftedness, those children whose talents are lost through lack of detection and nurturing. We can never know how much talent has been lost for lack of discovery or development, nor can we assess the magnitude of that loss to the world. The music that was never composed, the medical cure that was never discovered, the political strategy that might have averted a war. Schools need to be a place where individual differences are appreciated, where talents are recognized and nurtured. Everyone benefits when there is greater freedom to develop one's own abilities. Gifted children must feel free to express the fullness of themselves, to strive to be their personal best instead of dumbing down, to set high aspirations, to pursue their passions, and to be able to learn new things every single day in school, rather than simply wait while others are learning. Giftedness is not about the potential for success. It's the potential for wisdom, authenticity, and integrity. And we need to cultivate these cherished values. Our challenge today is to preserve the fine qualities of egalitarian education while respecting and supporting individual differences. Sacrificing the needs of the gifted to preserve time-honored traditions is costly to the health of your nations and to the world. We need the fully developed abilities of all gifted and talented children. The balance between egalitarianism and the pursuit of excellence can be achieved by perceiving the population of gifted students differently and allowing them to soar. Thank you. Is it time for the next person, or is it time for questions? Or a few questions, okay.
We do have time for a few questions. Yeah. Yes. Any questions?
Yes, in the back.
You said earlier that if you use IQ tests properly,
Yes.
They wouldn't discriminate against or learning disabled children. How do you use IQ
Oh, what a wonderful question. Yes, it's a very important question. I said if you use IQ tests appropriately, they find gifted children with learning disabilities, twice exceptional children. They don't discriminate against those children. And the simple answer to that question is, because my background is in special education and learning disabilities, I look at the high scores as indication of giftedness. I look at the low scores as indication of learning disabilities, and I do not derive a full-scale IQ score, because the full-scale IQ score smooshes them all together, the strengths and the weaknesses, to diminish the child's abilities and overlook the disabilities. You have to look at those high scores and low scores separately and look at the degree of difference between the high and the low.
I got the mic down here. My name is Lena Anderson. You talked about intersectionality and being twice exceptional. Is there a correlation between being bilingual and having a higher IQ? I mean, is this intersectionality?
That's a great question, because I've been thinking about this for nearly 6 years since I first came to Denmark. And I've been so impressed with all of the people that I've met. And I felt like everyone here that I interacted with had a higher level of intelligence than the people that I'm used to dealing with in the United States. Oops, that's being recorded. But it's true. And because I was talking to people who asked such good and interesting and higher level questions, it made me wonder, is there something about being multilingual that enhances intellectual capacity? And I just asked Nicholas, a young man who's at the home where I'm staying, if had he ever met someone who was multilingual and not smart, and he said no. So I think that there probably is a higher, something is happening in the brain, I believe. I have no research on this, it's just my observation from being in Denmark and in Holland, that the people that I've met who are multilingual are incredibly bright. That if you were to have IQ tests, I think you would be surprised at how high up the majority of the gifted community in Denmark really is. I think it's probably closer to the third standard deviation than the second.
Okay.
Because of their bilingual culture.
Last short question.
Yeah, okay. I'm Elizabeth Melroth. I'm from Sweden.
Hi.
And hi. And so we have this dilemma that we don't test our children.
I know.
And we don't test them until we have found something that doesn't work.
Right.
So my question is, what is your beliefs if we put teachers, pedagogic staff, in professional development about giftedness, so they learn about the characteristics, etc. They cannot test the children, but do you believe that the teachers still can recognize, maybe not identify, but recognize the gifted children in their classrooms?
Maybe.
And a
but
short
you should answer that question, because Paul has developed an instrument to help teachers recognize gifted children, and he has been successful in getting teachers to understand gifted children from that tool.
I'm going to give a lecture on that later. Thank you very much.
But I know I'm supposed to stop. That's what the applause were for, but I have to finish. You asked me what I think. You're not going to like my answer. I'm just telling you this. In the United States, when we had teachers try to find the gifted children in their class, the teachers found the children who were most attentive, who were the cleanest, who were the ones that who were teacher pleasers. And they called the teacher pleasers gifted. There's been better results getting the parents to recognize giftedness than to get the teachers to recognize it. I told you wouldn't like it.
Thank you very much.